in prison. Good Bible-knowing Christians know the story. John is thrown in prison and eventually beheaded. But did you ever notice how there's a lot of talk about prisoners in our Bible? The words captive and prisoner, they pop up a lot. I remember growing up with the concept that the people in prison were the bad guys. The prisoners were the lock them up and throw away the key type of people. Then I started reading the Bible. I first noticed it as a teen, but much more strongly in my early and mid-20s. There was this discontinuity that kept itching at me, kept nagging at me. As I was reading the Bible, I noticed the Bible was painting a very different picture of a prisoner than the one I had grown up with. It seemed to me that in the Bible, we were the prisoners. The Israelites were prisoners of famine and of war and exile. Paul and Silas had amazing prison stories. Furthermore, I began noticing the Bible was painting a different picture of prisoner, which the modern-day church seems to have forgotten about. Let me ask you this, no show of hands or anything, but let me ask this community, how many of us have a prisoner that we are praying for regularly? Is that an offensive question to ask? Does it imply that you have friends in very low places? Now let me put us in contrast to the very early church. The church of the Christians figuring out what it means to be a Christian right after Jesus' resurrection. Would many in that church have possibly known a close friend, maybe even a family member, who suffered, maybe even died for their faith? Would they be so proud of that situation that they wouldn't even let me go on without taking the opportunity to tell that story so impassionedly? They'd silence me immediately with gruesome details of a harrowing tale. Imagine the emotion of a community touched by such a situation. That community digging away in the world for the Christian church, for you and me. Who are the persecuted? Who are the prisoners? Well, there are several constants in life. Some say two, death and taxes. But another eternal truth is that power corrupts. It's human nature. It takes a questing beyond what is human to avoid it. Power corrupts. So throughout human history, as individual human beings come together in an effort to share and be in the world together, we organize ourselves into whatever such systems and structures. But each system and structure still remains vulnerable to that eternal truth. Power corrupts. And those in power will most often do whatever they need to maintain that power. The first Christians brought something a little different to the Roman world they were born into. Roman society was an orderly one. But Christians wanted to throw some of those rules away. Jesus' questions like, who is my neighbor? They have political implications if people take them seriously. This was the one forum where all people could come together and be equal and share something very deep and meaningful in worship and studying the Word. It really didn't matter if you were Jew or Greek, a man or a woman, sick or well, a worker, or a slave. And there was the problem for the powers that be. Once the servant class got a little taste of that equality, well, then there could be serious trouble. They could rise up, they could take to the streets, they could slaughter us all of society could collapse. The early Christians were persecuted. They were thrown into prison. They were put into prison for their faith. Some were even killed for their faith. But not just persecuted for a title. They suffered these things because what being Christian meant. Being Christian meant all at table together. All sisters and brothers. Divisions truly eliminated, boundaries brought down. It wasn't a title, it was a way of living, and it was threatening to the status quo. So in many early Christian communities, knowing and praying for someone in prison would have very much been an honor. To know someone who stood up for their faith, so much so to become a threat to the powers that be, who are corrupt and require challenging. So how do we compare to the early Christians? How many among our community have gone so far as to stand up and be imprisoned for what's righteous, making us all proud? I just want to note that John Thomas, the former president and general minister of the United Church of Christ, certainly has. Now, some of us may find it easy to sit back and say, well, we live in the best country in the world. We don't have to go through those shenanigans anymore. But I wholeheartedly disagree. And I feel quite personally challenged by this comparison of the Christians of the 2000s and the Christians of the 40s and 50s. I can certainly not deny the marvel that is the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. But that was a long time ago. And I'd like to tell you a story about myself. When I was in 9th grade, I learned about Amnesty International. It just blew my mind. After learning so much about our Constitution and everything in middle school, it blew my mind that there were places in the world where people could still be held in prison for days, weeks, months, years, decades, without ever having a trial, or ever even being told why they are there with formal charges. There's even a word for these people. They are the disappeared. They are the disappeared because that's usually what happens. Often political objectors, they just disappear one day, and family, friends, children, spouses are left to wander for sometimes a lifetime. As a 9th grader, I was filled with mixed emotions as I learned of these stories. On the one hand, my heart broke so fully to learn that there were so many stories like this. To see how there were so many places in the world, still in the 1990s, where this could happen. On the other hand, I had great pride in my own country. I was born and raised in a land where none of my friends, family, or loved ones would ever have to be locked up without a fair trial. I beamed with pride as I wrote letter after letter after letter asking for the freedom of so many disappeared. For 3 years, I was the top letter writer in my high school. I wrote letters at home, I wrote letters at family functions, I wrote letters during classes. All the while thankful. I lived in a country where this could never happen to me. I don't live in that country anymore. And neither do you. When our president signed the National Defense Authorization Act for 2012, he removed that fundamental right of trial and even formal charges. There are now structures established in our own country for unlimited detention and imprisonment of our own citizens without trial or even charge. That's a fundamental change in how we organize ourselves as a society. A change that undeniably helps maintain the established power at the sacrifice of freedoms for those with less power. And I'm wondering how many Christians in our country even know that happened, let alone cared. Let alone cared enough to put their own freedom on the line to fight for everyone's freedom. I'm disappointed in myself and almost a little bit jealous. There are people in our country over the last 10 months who have taken up the cause to sacrifice their freedoms for a better world for us all. Just this past week, on Tuesday, hundreds came out to Philadelphia to protest how our Pennsylvania governor continues to cut money for schools, but finds money to build more prisons. People were protesting just yesterday in Philadelphia, where the mayor is making it illegal to feed the needy in certain areas. Right here in Philadelphia, they're trying to outlaw the grace of needed food. And these days, protesting, of course, not just puts you in danger of going to prison, but also comes with the risk of getting pepper sprayed, an act which is illegal even on non-combatant prisoners in jail. So I'm a bit jealous. I'm jealous that this courage to stand up and risk losing freedom. I'm jealous that courage and that call seems to have left the Christian community. And maybe even me personally. So in our world today, this crazy America of 2012, these two verses from Mark provide a great message. We look to Jesus to do better. Jesus heard a man was put in jail unjustly, and Jesus got off his duff. He knew he could stay silent no longer. Jesus saw injustice, and it touched him, and it moved him. Jesus was moved by the injustice to take action. Jesus was moved by the injustice to go out and teach. And so we do the same. Jesus was moved by the injustice to go out and fulfill his calling. This is where he does it. This is the impetus. This is what gets him going. He sees the injustice and he says, it's time for me to start being me, living God's call for me. And so we do the same. Jesus could not sit silent, and neither can we. If we are the ones called to sacrifice freedom and become a prisoner for the beliefs of our faith, may we manifest the courage to do so with pride. But if we are not, may we at least, with pride and maybe even a little jealousy, look on all of the prisoners with a heart that knows that there is only one true arbiter of justice. For the human heart is corruptible. So to judge is for God. To love with no bounds, all at table as family, that is our quest. Amen.